everyone!
I'm Max from Canada.
I'm Suji from Thailand.
Welcome to our channel. We are a married couple living in Thailand together with our 12 dogs, and today we're doing something that we have not done before. World War II from the Swedish perspective. It's gonna be quite interesting. We're gonna learn a lot. I know that Sweden are usually like neutral when it comes to everything, to war in particular, so it's gonna be interesting to know what's going on by the Armchair Historian YouTube channel. By the way, we have a Buy Me a Coffee channel membership if you want to support our channel, and also if you make a donation, we can react to one of your videos. Yeah, it's up to you if you want to have a priority.
Yeah.
Let's get started.
Let's go!
In 1939, war swept across Europe. As conflict advanced toward its borders, Sweden managed to maintain its neutrality. Situated in the frigid north, the country was no stranger to harsh winters. Yet, with its neighbors falling under occupation and external pressure mounting, the Swedes were compelled to consider if their accustomed resilience to the cold could parallel their ability to withstand the storms of war. Though it had once been a great power in Europe, Sweden had long been absent from the chessboard of European conflict. The traumatic loss of Finland to the Russians and the cession of Sweden's final mainland possessions following the Napoleonic Wars pushed Sweden to pursue a policy of neutrality. Aided by its strategic position in Northern Europe and lack of entanglement in European military alliances, Sweden was able to successfully remain neutral throughout the First World War, though its government favored the Central Powers.
You need to tell us about how they lost Finland, because we know that Finland were part of Sweden before, and they lost some to Russia, but we never reacted to like what happened exactly. Maybe we should actually.
First World War, though its government favored the Central Powers. Despite suffering some economic hardship and political strife, Sweden avoided the post-war devastation of many other European states, and public consensus strongly backed continued neutrality in future conflicts. However, as the 1930s came to an end and the clouds of war once more gathered above Europe, Sweden's resolve would be put to the test. On September 1st, 1939, Germany began its invasion of Poland. Despite its immediate declaration of neutrality, Sweden had already indirectly contributed to the war. From the panzers dashing across the border to the fighter bombers strafing Polish refugees, it's estimated that almost 60% of the iron used to build these deadly machines came from Swedish mines.
Yeah, see, you cannot. It's funny, you can claim neutrality, but it's like the US always claim neutrality, but they are the ones that feed both sides of a war, that going on. Like, they claim neutrality, but they are feeding both sides, and they're playing games, and they say, oh no, we don't intervene. I feel like it's like this. Yeah, you intervene. If you feed one of the country or both of the country munition, you're literally helping them, So it's like...
Well, it's about business.
Yeah, it's business, but you're not neutral.
Of Sweden's iron supply to the Nazi war machine, both Britain and Germany rushed to negotiate with the Swedes, who assured the British that they wouldn't increase iron exports to Germany above their pre-war level. However, by slyly including the now occupied territories of Czechoslovakia and Poland within their definition of German pre-war imports, Sweden was able to simultaneously satisfy the German desire for increased iron deliveries. Following the fall of Poland, Sweden was faced with a threat much closer to home as the Soviet Union began its invasion of Finland. As Sweden and Finland enjoyed close cultural and historic ties, the Soviet invasion led to widespread outrage amongst the Swedish public. Additionally, Stockholm was well aware that a Soviet victory in Finland would place the Red Army at Sweden's doorstep. Therefore,
yeah, because at the beginning, Russia were on Germany's side at the very, very beginning of the war. I think that's what happened. I'm not sure. I'm really bad when it comes to history.
Deviating
But
slightly from its traditional neutrality, Sweden declared itself a non-belligerent in the unfolding Winter War, which allowed Sweden to transfer considerable quantities of weapons to the Finns while avoiding war with the Soviet Union. Drawing from its limited stockpiles, Sweden provided Finland with 84,000 rifles, 112 artillery pieces, and 25 aircraft. Additionally, over 8,000 Swedish volunteers successfully fought alongside the outnumbered Finnish army. Though Swedish aid helped prevent
Very similar to Ukraine, right? How the US and other countries are founding Ukraine. And notice how Ukraine are like still standing right now. They are not getting blown up, even though they are much smaller in army and in power, because they are getting so much artillery from other countries, especially the US. So it can give a big advantage to a country
Finland's complete
like Finland
collapse,
in a situation like this.
the tiny Nordic nation was still forced to yield to Soviet territorial demands in a Swedish-brokered peace deal. In the chaos of the Winter War, Britain saw an opportunity to disrupt Sweden's continued iron exports to Germany. Under the guise of aiding Finland, Britain offered to land thousands of troops in Norway before transporting them over Swedish railway to the front lines of Finland. Once within Sweden, however, these British troops would be directed to seize iron mines and other critical infrastructure, shutting down Swedish trade with Germany. But to Britain's displeasure, both Sweden and Norway saw through this ruse and denied British permission to carry out this would-be double cross. Nevertheless, war would come to Scandinavia all the same. On April 9, 1940, less than a month after the conclusion of the Winter War, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway, Sweden's two western neighbors. While Denmark was immediately overrun, Norway fought on long enough for an Allied expeditionary force to arrive, though this too was soon defeated by the Germans.
Oh no.
Despite the battles raging across the border, Sweden itself was not invaded, as Germany felt no need to risk its current stable Swedish iron supply.
Yeah, exactly.
Regardless, Swedish diplomats and politicians were deeply intimidated by Germany's show of force. With both of its neutral neighbors suffering unprovoked invasions, it was becoming increasingly clear that the fate of Sweden's neutrality might be decided not in Stockholm, but in Berlin. For all their outrage at Germany's invasions, there would be no Swedish intervention. Swedish politicians were divided on how to respond to the conflict unfolding all around them, but were ultimately fearful of German retribution. While many in Sweden's government advocated for continued neutrality, a notable voice in favor of intervention was Sweden's Crown Prince, Gustav Adolf, who argued that Sweden's moral duty to defend against injustice should take precedence over its desire for peace. In the end, the voices of neutrality proved louder. Similarly to the political situation, the Swedish military response to the German invasion of Denmark and Norway was mixed. Sweden had long assumed that the Soviet Union posed the greatest threat to Swedish independence and had given relatively little attention to German aggression. Though fortifications had been constructed along the southern coastline, Sweden failed to mobilize its military before the German assault, meaning that their borders were initially only lightly defended. Within less than a month, however, Sweden had called up an additional 230,000 men to defend the southern coast and the long frontier with Norway. With the effectiveness of Germany's war machine displayed right before its eyes, Sweden quickly realized that its own military forces were inadequate. Sweden's conscript-based army was highly motivated and well-suited for local defense, but lacked any significant amount of heavy equipment. The Swedish Air Force was additionally in poor shape, with only 180 outdated aircraft compared to more than 4,000 commanded by the German Luftwaffe. Attempts to purchase additional equipment were complicated by Sweden's neutral status, as most nations were unwilling to sell valuable weapon systems when their own forces desperately needed replenishment.
Yeah, well, bleep around and find out.
Luckily, Sweden was eventually able to leverage their industrial know-how to begin the production of their own military equipment, a practice which continues to this day. Slowly,
You don't give me, I will build it
resources
myself.
poured into national rearmament, but it would still take years for Sweden's anticipated resistance against Germany to be measured in months rather than weeks. On the economic front, Sweden also found itself on the back foot, with a vengeful Finland joining Hitler's war against the Soviet Union to reclaim lost territory. Sweden became completely surrounded by the Axis.
Whoa.
Making matters worse, a German blockade cut Sweden off from its western trade routes and confined its economic activity to the Baltic. Though Sweden had stockpiled resources, it was forced to rely on trade with Axis-aligned nations for many of its most important goods.
Okay.
Eventually, Sweden was able to negotiate safe passage through the Atlantic for several ships a month, allowing for the import of vital resources from the West. However, this lifeline would be continually threatened by both Britain and Germany. With their relative vulnerability early in the war, Sweden felt forced to acquiesce to a series of unsavory German demands. Immediately following the fall of Norway, Germany successfully pressured Sweden into allowing the passage of off-duty German soldiers through Sweden on their way to occupation duty in Norway.
What did he
A
think was
year
going
later,
to happen?
in June of
This situation
1941,
really familiar.
Sweden was faced with a much more
In Thailand with Japan?
Yes!
When Japan,
so familiar.
when Japan came to Thailand, he said, well, either we invade you or you like kind of ally with us, because Thailand wanted to be neutral. And Thailand said, okay. And then he built some kind of a road train station, like to Myanmar.
India.
Yeah.
And then their reason they wanted to go to India, but it's not.
It's still familiar.
Yeah, it feels so familiar for everything.
The Sweden of Asia.
like the talking, the everything. Like don't invade that, but we're gonna give you this.
Because Thailand technically I've never been invaded by anyone.
yeah,
for
but we
history.
also surrounded too. It's
Yeah.
really like this. It's funny.
So you had no choice again. It's like Sweden.
serious crisis when Germany demanded that Sweden allow 14,000 heavily armed Wehrmacht troops to pass through Sweden on their way to participate in the invasion of the Soviet Union. This demand flagrantly violated Sweden's neutrality and set off a minor political crisis in the country. Eventually, it was
Whoa.
decided to grant the German troops passage, but it was made clear that this would be a one-time exception. In July, when Germany again requested to send armed troops through the country, Sweden refused. Nevertheless, in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, Sweden allowed 75,000 tons of goods to be transported to Finland to facilitate their participation in the war against the Soviet Union. On the return trip through Sweden, these trains evacuated wounded German personnel. The Swedish public's attitude toward
Damn.
Germany during the Second
Finland are sandwiched. Finland, they take it the worst because they are sandwiched. The Soviet Union going after them. Germany that want to go to the Soviet Union. They are sandwiched between everything that's going on. They're they're in the corner and they cannot do anything.
Yeah, I
like,
cannot like
yeah.
think or anything.
Finland are having the worst
World
of
War
all the.
was complex. On one hand, many argued that Sweden had gone too far in its accommodation of German demands. But, on the other hand, cultural and political ties between Sweden and Nazi Germany remained quite strong. Openly fascist sympathies were quite rare in Sweden, though some 200 Swedes did serve in the Waffen-SS. However, most Swedes did not equate affinity for Germany with Nazism, and there was some sense of normalcy between the two countries. But as Sweden was soon to find out, there was nothing normal about Germany's plans for Europe. Like most of the world, Swedish officials had reacted with relative indifference to Germany's initial persecution of Jews. Following Germany's early annexations, immigration laws were tightened to prevent Jewish refugees from fleeing to Sweden, and there would even be some demonstrations against the import of Jews. However, when Germany began implementing its final solution in Norway, Sweden dramatically changed its approach to the unfolding Holocaust.
Yeah, I'm curious that it's easy in 2024 to say like how they didn't know what was Germany planned, but I feel like back then the communication, there was no internet, no television, no it's not as easy as obvious as it seemed. And in retrospect, it seemed like why they were so slow to react. But when you think about the technology back then, or the absence of technology, I think it makes sense that like they got caught off guard and now they are reacting. Like,
Hundreds of Norwegian Jews were allowed to cross the Swedish border, and Swedish citizens expressed their disgust at Germany's genocidal policies. When Germany attempted to eliminate the Jewish population of nearby Denmark, Sweden declared that it would grant asylum to all Danish Jews who reached its shores, leading to a massive rescue effort that saved around 7,000 people, the vast majority of Denmark's Jewish community. Later in the war, Swedish diplomatic protection was extended to Jewish civilians all across Europe, with Swedish diplomats such as Raoul Wallenberg involved in aiding thousands more Jews from other European nations. Sweden also became involved in militarily supporting its neighbors to a limited extent. Beginning in 1943, Sweden began arming and training thousands of Danish and Norwegian soldiers. Officially, these troops were advertised as police forces, but in reality, they were designed to move into Denmark and Norway at the end of the war, securing the countries until their respective governments could return from exile. In contrast to its proactive support of its occupied neighbors, Sweden insisted on its right to trade with Germany, even as it became clear that the tides of the conflict were shifting. With only intermittent access to the West, Sweden had come to rely on German-supplied coal to heat its homes and power its factories. In exchange for this coal, Sweden exported ores such as iron and mechanical components such as ball bearings. Ball bearings in particular were crucial for the production of military vehicles.
See, Sweden exported 58% of its ball bearing to Germany and 31% to Britain, balancing its trade to maintain neutrality while supporting both sides of the conflict. That's what
Smart.
Well, survival of the fittest, right? You need to you need to survive at all costs.
Aircraft and other machinery, highlighting the strategic importance of Sweden's industrial exports to the German war machine. The Allies did not necessarily object to the concept of Swedish trade with Germany, as it was understood that Sweden had little choice. But the Allies were furious that Sweden chose to pay for its goods with militarily vital supplies. At one point, American representatives informally threatened to bomb Swedish factories if they did not reduce exports to Germany.
Wow.
Gradually, however, under increasing pressure from the Western Allies, Sweden rolled back its trade with Germany until it almost completely ceased by the end of 1944. As 1945 dawned in Europe, the eventual collapse of the Third Reich seemed all but inevitable. No longer fearing a German invasion, Sweden began to favor the Allied powers far more overtly. Almost 200,000 refugees from Sweden's war-torn neighbors were accepted into the country. Allied planes were relatively unharried if they strayed into Swedish airspace, and Sweden even began talks with the Allies about participating in the liberation of Denmark, although this ultimately proved unnecessary. By the time Hitler's empire fell in May of 1945, Sweden had seemingly chosen a side. Nevertheless, the legacy of Sweden...
It's easy to find a side when one side is winning and one is losing.
Yes.
I feel like the way you said it, it's like, yeah, but if Germany had won, the Sweden would have taken maybe their side too, you know? It's okay to be opportunistic. It's the survival of your people. I mean, I
Yes.
kind of get it in a way.
Smart.
But
Participation in the Second World War continues to haunt the country. With the benefit of hindsight, many question if Sweden was too quick to accommodate Germany, or if it could have done more to help the Allies. Most importantly, many have begun to wonder if neutrality could truly be justified in a conflict that was waged not just against states, but against humanity itself.
when it's neutrality in a different side of the world, it's one thing. But when it's neutrality with your neighbor and people that like you're in good relation with, like at one point in the video, they were going after the Jew from Denmark and Norway, so Sweden kind of changed their mind, right? So I feel like when it touched people that you're connected with, you have an ethical, like, not dilemma, but you have an ethical, like, responsibility to help your neighbor, your friends, in a way. I think that's how I view this, but I think it's a little bit tricky.
And it's really good. So basically, they never got like invested on anything, even they are in the middle of like a very dangerous war.
Maybe deep down he knew which state he always wanted to be on the side of the Norway, Denmark, and these country, but Russia was in the way in a way because they were going after Finland, and then he wanted to have an exit strategy in case that thing didn't go well. That's why they kind of play both sides, and they didn't feel like they had a choice. But in hindsight, it's difficult to, without knowing more, like if they are to blame more than what he described in the video or not. So maybe you can tell us more in the comment, actually, or maybe you can suggest us more video to understand even more what was happening in Sweden, because Sweden was like, the way that he talked about in the video, they were kind of in the middle of everything, but they were kind of very powerful because they had a lot of resources. So they were powerful in that war. Yeah.
And also, like, they were a king, right? The rule things too, and also they also already have government too.
And the king wanted one thing, but at the end he didn't go with the king idea.
Yeah, he probably listened.
He went with the neutrality, even though the king wanted them to be more proactive. So yeah, that was an amazing video.